Welcome back to Phenomenal Conversations with Mr. Short. With this podcast, I wanted to interview phenomenal educators. Last week, I had Eric Court, and that really enriched me, and I'm sure everyone that listened to it. But today, I have Dr. Louisa. Now, I'm not going to say Miss Louisa Moats, Dr. Louisa Moats, who's one of the foremost literacy experts really in the world. So I'm excited to have her on. All y'all that listen to LETRS, when this plays tomorrow, I'm sure you're gonna be very excited to see this. But I kind of wanted to get into Dr. Louisa Moats, the person, or Louisa Moats, the person, and also dabble a little bit into her literacy career and what she's been able to do. So Dr. Moats, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, thank you. And it's fun to be with you today.
Thank you. So let's get into it. I always call it my Walking Dead question. So I was asked, how did you get into education?
I got in by accident. I was a music major in college. My first job, I got, and then I had to go to secretarial school to get a job. This is way back when opportunities for women were more limited. I got a job as a secretary in the neuropsychology department at the New England Medical Center. And my boss recognized that I had more ability and taught me to be what he called a laboratory technician in the neuropsychology department, which meant simply that I learned a lot about brain function. I learned through many experiences with they called them patients, but the clients who came through the clinic had a number of neurologically based problems with functioning and with learning. And some of those clients or patients, there was nothing, they were not ill in any way, but they were referred for reading and writing problems and what we call learning disabilities now. And I was fascinated by the fact that these kids had learning disabilities, but the neuropsychology test battery at the time, this is before neuroimaging was available. It showed that there wasn't any brain damage in these kids or anything like that. They just had real problems learning to read and write. Mm-hmm. So my boss kicked me out the door. He said, you need to go get a master's degree. And there's a fellowship program you need to apply for. Goodbye. So that's, fortunately I had these influential people who steered me toward this. And then after my master's degree, I worked first in a public school, then in a what was called a treatment center for kids with complex problems of learning and behavior. And then after that, another day treatment program where some of the kids just couldn't learn to read. And I thought I understood what was going on, but it wasn't until, I guess, about 10 years after my master's degree that I went back to the New England Medical Center as the learning specialist in neuropsychology at that point, with a lot of experience and a master's degree. And my boss, the same guy, said, you can't keep this job unless you get a doctorate. So I applied to the school down the street, which was the Harvard Graduate School of Education, in their reading program, not knowing what I was getting into. They took me. I started a doctoral program, and that's when my real education began. There we go.
So it kind of seems like you kind of went through so you had no mind to be in education before you started discovering that it wasn't anything wrong with the kids. It was more that it was something reading. It had nothing to do with some or the other type of issue. So you had no mind to get into education before all of this?
I did not. I really did not. and my own, I had to be licensed as a teacher, and in the teacher preparation programs, I kept thinking, well, these things they're teaching me don't make a lot of sense and they're not very useful. And furthermore, I don't feel really ready to teach somebody with a learning problem. I don't really know what I'm doing. And like many, many teachers I've encountered since, it was kind of this dirty secret in the back of my mind. Well, I really don't know what I'm doing. And I hope that next year's teacher knows better, because these kids that I've been responsible for haven't made that much progress. And I felt kind of like a pretender in that role. And curiously, after getting a doctorate and really learning what was supposed to go on and really learning what was happening when the kids couldn't read or write, then I was kind of too advanced to be a teacher. But so I became a clinician, a psychologist, and a teacher of teachers. And in the process of doing all this, I've learned a lot about how to teach, but a lot of that has been from great teachers that I've collaborated with in one way or another.
All right, so I guess my question kind of follow up then is, what was like the first thing you found, like working with kids with those reading difficulties? What is like the common trend that you find as far as why those kids have struggles reading?
Well, the common denominator is difficulty with specific language functions that are necessary, or capacities and skills that are the foundations for learning to read and spell. So they're linguistic skills, and they are very specific. They are whether or not the student can recognize what the speech sounds in a spoken word are and take them apart. So if I say the word, let's say the word, let's take a transparent one, the word dog, I have to know that there are three sounds in that word, d, ah, g, and that those letters represent those sounds. And as obvious as that might seem to people who can already read, it is not obvious to kids who have trouble. So what the kids who have trouble are trying to do is memorize that string of letters for the whole word, or somehow imprint the image of those letters on the back of their brains so they can remember it. That's very ineffective. It's and what we need, the essence of the teaching process is to teach the kids the identity of those speech sounds that language is made up of, and then the way that letters represent those sounds in our English language, which is a complex system. We wish it was more straightforward, but it isn't. So if we're teaching kids what the letter O is doing, well, it's representing, in my dialect, it's representing awe, because I say dog, I don't say dog, right? I say dog. It's representing that sound awe in the word dog as it does in the words on and off in my dialect. But the letter O does a lot of other different things in our writing system.
Right.
So all of that has to be taught explicitly to kids for them to get what we call the code, the decoding process. And if you can't decode that way by sound symbol association, then you can't remember the whole words. So the ironic thing here is that to remember the whole words and recognize them instantly when you see them in print, you have to have gone through that process of analyzing the speech sounds, associating the letters and the letter groups with those sounds, and then putting it together so that your brain is recognizing that word as if it was recognizing a whole word, but what it's really done is recognize the parts first and
Okay.
then put those together to recognize the whole.
Awesome. So we're gonna get into more why it isn't as that aspect of teaching, whether it's phonics and being able to go through that progression isn't taught as much in teaching a little bit and a little bit. But I kind of wanted to touch on first. I saw you're a part of a lot of organizations when it comes to dyslexia and things like that. So why have you focused so much on dyslexia as far as one of your areas of focus? Whether it's with, I don't know if it's committees or different things you've written on dyslexia. Why have you focused as much on that?
Okay. Great question. Yes, I was on the board of the International Dyslexia Association for a number of years, very active in the organization for a couple of decades. The reason for it was that when I went into clinical practice after my doctorate was over and I got licensed as a psychologist so that I could earn a living in rural Vermont where I was living, I began to see case after case amounting to several thousand individuals who were referred to me for evaluation because of difficulties learning to read. And these individuals spanned the gamut from professors at Dartmouth College, where I was living near, to rural poor kids. Vermont is a very white state, so there wasn't a lot of racial diversity, but there was a lot of socioeconomic diversity and cultural diversity. And so I saw kids who, were in very impoverished conditions, living in the backwoods and going to these country schools, and then everything in between. And so because I saw so many people who were struggling to learn to read and who are failing in school because of it and referred to me because of it, I had to learn as much as I could from the existing research and the existing science about what was going on with these kids. And the organization that was sort of most interested in bringing science and practice together was the International Dyslexia Association. So I made a lot of contacts. That was one way I made a lot of contacts with researchers who were shedding light on reading difficulties, and dyslexia is the most common type of developmental reading disorder.
Okay, so and just to those watching, I guess dyslexia is one of the things that's weird. I found someone was telling me a lot of prisoners, most of them have dyslexia. I thought that was one of the weirdest stats out there. Not weird. I mean, I guess it makes sense. And even I think 1 in 5 people have some form of dyslexia. So
let's talk data a little bit.
Okay.
Whether you and so I want to preface what I'm saying by saying that I've moved away from a focus on dyslexia myself, because advocates for dyslexic kids have been very successful in the last 10 years getting states to recognize what dyslexia is and incorporate the term into their state guidelines and so on. But the larger picture is this, and I was just reading about it today. Okay, 47% of kids of color in the United States who took the National Assessment of Reading, National Assessment of Educational Progress, scored below basic in reading in this last go around at the 4th grade level. That is an appalling statistic. It means huge numbers of kids, and there is, of course, an overlap of racial identity with poverty, huge overlap. But And so kids of color are failing to learn to read in huge numbers, almost half in the United States as a whole, which is totally unacceptable. And of course, there is this, what we say, school to pipeline, school to prison pipeline, so that unfortunately, that is a causal factor in the disproportionate number of people of color who end up in the adjudication pipeline and end up in prison. So then if you look at a prison population and you give them a reading test, well, it's not surprising that 3/4, this is the statistic I know, 3/4 are reading at a 4th grade level or below. And that is not a functional level for an adult who wants to get a decent paying job, right? And who has to fill out a job application and do things with a computer, even if it's a blue collar job, which we have thought of in the past as not requiring a high level of literacy. Well, these days, even in the trades, okay, that say the skilled trades that pay better, that are so-called blue collar, where you can make a decent living, you still need, if you're an electrician, you're a plumber, you're a skilled carpenter, you're skilled at some aspect of building or construction, where there are job opportunities, you have to still have a certain level of being able to keep records, being able to write reports, being able to read manuals, being able to follow a blueprint. I mean, all of these things require some level of literacy, and we're turning out huge numbers of kids who don't have that level of literacy. And this isn't, to me, a national crisis. It goes way beyond who you use the word dyslexia for.
Well, and honestly, what I kind of wanted to get a little bit into, as far as you've written many scholarly journals, and it's almost too many to really count. But a lot of this been going back to the 70s, before I even was born. And I've been able to read like a lot of research from even back then. And I think I read a book from a lady named Marva Collins, and she didn't talk about it in those terms, but she kind of mentioned about how she discovered with phonics, how a kid can learn 1,000 words, but sometimes you do. I guess she called it the look-say method back then. I guess I'm young enough where I never heard it phrased that way, but now they call it the 3Qing model. I guess that's the formal word. So what I wanted to ask is, why does it seem like education is and I guess we're going to talk about science of reading and all of that, since even the 70s, there's been talk, and obviously people like yourself have talked about how we need to focus more on phonics and teaching kids to formally read. And it's kind of been I hate to use the word battle between phonics-based and whole language. Why do you think it's been such a slow progression toward now that we're getting toward science of reading? And I want to dive a little bit into that just itself. But why do you think it's been such a slow progression in regards to that, even though the research backs it up?
That's a wonderful question. And you obviously have done your homework on this issue to know that. And I'm very aware, because I got my doctorate in the late 1970s. And I'm 76 years old now. And and my lead professor, Jean Chall, was in the thick of the battle at that time as an advocate of phonics, doing battle with what was whole language. And really say is just point to the words, make it motivating, and the kids will somehow learn how to read, which is totally misinformed. But you're right, for 5 decades, we have had a research consensus over and over, building over and over, where there is no solid research support for whole language or 3Qing, or these methods of, telling kids, oh, take a peek at the picture and see if you can guess what the word might be. There is no research support for this, which is, as you have implied, the most popular and prevalent way of teaching reading, which flies in the face of what we know from research. It's really an astonishing thing. And it's the question that I'm asked, and it's the question I ask myself over and over, because I've been asking myself this as I have confronted this wall of ignorance that is deeply entrenched in our education system, from universities to the textbooks they use, to the programs that districts buy, to the professional organizations that guide teachers. To what you see on the internet is absolutely astonishing, this disconnect. So why is this the case? And I keep having to come up with answers to this.
Mhm.
And I think it's a combination of things. I think at the heart of it is that the reading process, as I've tried to describe, if you're going to learn to read the word dog, right?
Mhm.
It's invisible and it's counterintuitive. So there's no way that, just a layperson really can know what's going on as a child learns to read without studying it a bit or reading something about it, because you can't just kind of look in your own head to see the process. And it's insidious, because if you already know how to read, it seems as if you're just looking at whole words and taking them in, right? It seems as if it's a visual learning process. It seems as if it's a whole word process. It seems as if it should be very easy and simple, and all of that is very deceptive. What it seems to be, it is not. And what it seems to be is very deceptive, because it seems as if, well, you don't really need to know phonics to read those words. But now we have so much technology in the neurosciences and the cognitive sciences that show that, in fact, what's happening very fast in the brain is that we do translate printed words into speech, and we do need to have a speech representation for that printed word that we're reading in order to read it accurately. So that's one that's at the heart of it. I think that it's not easy to understand what in fact is going on. Secondly, we've had decades of teachers who are going into the profession not being taught this stuff themselves as they went through school. So this is the legacy of years of whole language practices, where
I honestly, I don't remember ever being taught to sign how to word. I honestly don't even think I ever went through that. Maybe I did. I probably just don't remember, but I don't remember ever doing it. So,
well, then you are the the kind of poster child, whatever, who wasn't taught it. But you've educated yourself, obviously, right here, and you're asking really great questions, and you have this basic insight about what's been missing. And it's not just phonics, it's the whole thing of analyzing language. It's also grammar and spelling, and knowing what our language is made up of, both at the level of spoken language and written language, and how written language represents spoken language at various levels of language organization. So what I'm saying in a nutshell is, if you've had no education about the structure of language, then it's not going to be obvious if you want to be a teacher. It's not going to be obvious what you need to teach to your kids for them to get it, because you don't have the knowledge. And a lot of my research early on was aimed at showing at a detailed level the difference between what teachers would need to know in order to teach these language skills explicitly to kids, and what they typically do know, which is very, very little. And how would you expect them to know if they weren't taught themselves?
All right, so I'm kind of, I guess, conflate these two questions. with science of reading, and it seems like it's almost 20 years after the fact, but I mean, apparently there was a thing going on when I was I guess I would have been in grade school at this time, the reading wars. I was like, that was an actual thing. And the reading panel report. And it seems like, I don't know if it's the basis for science of reading, but it seems like they kind of tie together. So why 20 years, I guess, or maybe 18, 19 years after the reading panel report and what they said kids need best to learn how to read, did it take so long to now where it seems like there's a push now for teachers learning the science of reading? Like I live here in Texas and they want all the teachers now, especially new teachers, as you kind of talked about, coming in to learn the science of reading. So it seems like finally that's become, something they should, teachers have to learn. So why do you, I guess at this point, it took 18, 19 years after this report was published. And honestly, I've seen it as a classroom teacher, these 5 things, embedding that in your instruction, whether it's the fluency, making sure, and honestly, I guess similar to you, you said you saw that the kids weren't growing. I had the experience of teaching 2nd grade 1 year, although I consider myself a great teacher. And that's when my eyes opened up. I didn't understand the progression of teaching phonics. I really didn't understand any of that, even though my sister is kind of a dyslexia specialist in the sense of her specialty as a teacher. But it made me understand. So why do you think it took so long? What caused this push for science of reading, even though, the research was out there in the panel 20 years ago?
The push I credit to a convergence of factors. Number one, parent advocacy. Parents whose kids weren't being educated in several states. Ohio is one, Arkansas is another, Texas, yes, where parents have been simply fed up that their kids with reading difficulties, and a lot of them were diagnosed as dyslexic. There wasn't a teacher anywhere trained to do what we know works. So that's been one big factor. Successful parent advocacy. I mean, 4 or 5 rabid parents who are determined to change things, they can change things if they know, how to work the levers of power. Secondly, the continuing convergence of science, not just the National Reading Panel report of 2000, but also subsequent reports that have said the same thing in a more elaborated way over and over again. So there's no denying what the major points of guidance of reading science is all about. I think third would be the continuing evidence that our kids have not been improving with these whole language methods, cueing system methods that have been utterly dominant in the last 10 years. And
trust me, I know.
just have exacerbated the problem. And the problem, of course, is, and then I think also in the background is our national movement toward concern for equity and justice. And I mean, there is no more fundamental issue than that the leveling the playing field for less advantaged kids who are disproportionately of color is going to begin with good instruction, effective instruction as early as we can get those kids, starting with preschool if possible, and certainly ensuring that they come out of the elementary or early elementary grades being able to read, so that the path to all kinds of advantages is open to them.
So, and one of the questions I kind of want to get to, and we touched on it even before the interview. Honestly, I watched some of your webinars and just different things you've had, and have your book, even speech to print, like right here. I would advise any educator to go buy it. But the thing I kind of just noticed, and as I was saying before the interview, like even though, I mean, you say you of course spent years in education, and also you spend a large portion of it on the academia side of it. Like, how do you maintain that same level of passion, even though, you know, it seems like, of course, you're removed from the classroom aspect of it? Because I feel like as a teacher, that's where I draw my energy from. So I don't even know how I would be once I kind of get removed from that. So how do you maintain that same passion, even though you're kind of removed from that classroom aspect of being there with the kids every day?
Well, I have many close associates now across the country who share the passion. I think all of my experiences with people who have suffered as a consequence of poor instruction or lack of opportunity to learn, those are powerful experiences that have shaped my passion for this. Everything from all those clients I had when I was a clinician in Vermont, to especially to my experiences in the Washington, D.C. so-called low-performing schools, where we, through a huge grant from the National Institutes of Health, were able, in spite of very difficult conditions in these high poverty schools, I mean, just horrendous conditions at times, we were able to show that poor kids of color, basically, because most of our students were African American students, and most of them lived in most of them were, the euphemism is free and reduced lunch. Most of them were achieving in the average range when the project was finished. And so it was so eye-opening for me to see so clearly that the problem was not the kids, the problem was the adults, and what the adults were and were not doing on behalf of those kids and their educational needs. And we couldn't solve the problem of poverty. We couldn't solve the problem of where those kids were living or the circumstances in which they were living. What we could do is provide them with a viable education, and we could educate the teachers so they knew what they were doing, and lo and behold, it worked. I mean, it was extremely taxing to try to accomplish this in those circumstances. I could go on all day about, okay, you go into a school and there are no books. You go into a school, there's no library. You go to a school, the classroom teachers have nothing to teach with. You go into school, the drinking fountains don't work. There's no toilet paper. The teachers are not showing up several days a week and no one's doing anything about it. These were the circumstances, but gradually, by supplying teaching materials, by training the teachers, by providing coaching and mentoring on how you teach, by providing a lot of substantive professional development. I mean, I was so naive when I went in there. I had the first class with the teachers. I thought, okay, I'm going to teach them about phoneme awareness right now, because these are kindergarten and first grade teachers. I mean, they were falling off their chairs, overwhelmed with the amount of information I was throwing at them. I mean, now I would know better not to do it that way. But I thought, okay, this is a matter of teaching them how to teach. And so I'm going to just go for it. And I had a lot to learn.
So I guess,
but my God, I mean, they rose to the occasion. They started teaching, the kids started learning. And after 2 years, they were saying to me, we can't believe it. Our kids are actually learning how to read. So that was stunning. And now when I see that it's possible to teach all kids how to read, basically, it's like, okay, I don't accept these excuses and the conditions that are obstacles. It's unacceptable. It continues to be unacceptable.
Is that kind of like the origins of your letters training? I hadn't had the pleasure of taking it myself, but I know it's, so how did you kind of, because even when I listened to some of the words, I was like, man, some of the stuff is a little, because if you're just learning about phonics, when you start getting into the sounds and the individual this and that, it could be a little, as you say, a bit much. You know, you still learning about the progression and then you start learning about the individual sounds. So how did that kind of like shape like the letters training and making sure teachers, you know, are trained to make sure they know how to approach teaching, I guess, phonics?
Well, all that's gone into LETRS, and just think the first edition of LETRS, for your listeners, it stands for Language Essentials for Teachers of Reading and Spelling, and it's a professional development course, really, that is, much to my astonishment, is being widely used across the United States. It was instrumental in the Mississippi initiative, and now in Alabama, it's statewide, and a number of other states. In Ohio, we have some big initiatives going. So what went into that was all that I had learned over the previous 25 years, starting with the work in DC. Well, no, I would say, well, no, that's not right. I would say the previous 15 years, starting with my work with teachers in Vermont, and then it was summer institutes in Vermont, and then in DC, I had to figure out how to teach this stuff to the teachers. And you're right, it's kind of overwhelmingly complex in the beginning, and I'm teaching people to learn the speech sound system of English. It's something they've never been taught. Teaching them to understand phonics at a deep level and understand how print represents speech at a deep level, so they could explain words to kids and kind of solve the mystery of how the English language works. And it is kind of mysterious at times. And I found that the way teachers respond to this is with gratitude on the whole. And they might say to me, gosh, this is overwhelming. My head hurts. It's like drinking from a fire hose. I don't know if I can learn this. I don't know if I'm going to be good at this, whatever. But we have had so much affirmation that, and I get it all the time, this is the best professional development I've ever had. Why didn't anybody teach me these things before? Now I really know what to do with my students. Now I really understand why reading is difficult for a lot of my students and how I need to go about teaching them. And I never knew that before. And along with that comes a kind of grieving about the kids that
you messed up on.
And those are the ones that stand out for me. I mean, the kids I messed up on. I tell you, that first year that I was responsible for teaching kids right out of my master's program, I was helpless. And I just think of those kids. I remember their names. I remember their faces. And I wish in another life I could go back and do it all over again.
I think that's,
yeah,
I mean, it's so, I mean, it's amazing. Even though I know you was talking about that, the thing that, I'm gonna say tripped me out, but kind of, I didn't understand until working at a lower grade level was that OU sound and how I was like, man, kids really have trouble with this. And then you figure out it's like 6 different, I was like, man, it was just mind boggling to me why, I guess, cause I didn't get why the kids struggle so much with it initially. Then I started saying there's so many different sounds. So I'm like, okay, that makes sense. So I can see where if you're a kid just learning to read, you don't know that it's a short U here. This place, it might be just a long O or whatever. It's so many different sounds and comes in this. So, and you see why it's so difficult to teach. So that was one of the things that's one of the biggest eye openers to me. And you think about, as you said, all the kids you taught that, and I taught primarily older grades, but at the same time, those kids that you taught, you didn't understand even the progression of teaching reading. Of, okay, you need to start with letter sound course. One is not like with some start with of course, you can't start with prefixes, but starting with some crazy, you have to go with a certain progression because
Yeah.
if you do, it works.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's amazing. It works. And I didn't realize that honestly until I read, I think Know Better, Do Better. I think it's Meredith Lyman and I think, is it Doug? They said they started a school and they started to do that. I thought that was the coolest thing, that they just focus on phonics progression. And then of course you can get to the reading, but I've seen if you start them here, they'll eventually, them skills will build on each other and they can get to the end of the line where it's diphthongs or whatever. So that's pretty cool. Just in my limited knowledge, I don't know all the advanced stuff yet, but just knowing the progression is a big help. But I've seen even a lot of younger teachers normally don't even know that, myself as a teacher.
Right.
So
It's you're speaking the truth. I mean, this is yeah, and what you've described is the experience of many, many people.
So,
Yeah.
all right. So I guess kind of sort of close out. Of course, and I can play these two questions as well. Talking about the changing landscape with the science of reading and that kind of being a bit more of a push for that. What do you hope to see in kind of the next 5 years? Thankful we're still blessed that you're here and still able to be out there as an educator. The next 5 years to see where education will be in the next 5 years. Now that there is a push for science of reading.
Well, I just hope that this will be different from other kind of episodes we've had in the past of, like, there was a time right after the National Reading Panel report when the Reading First initiative was ongoing and some schools really improved their instruction and got better results. And then there's this retrenchment and backsliding into whole language and these misconceived practices. And what I'm just so hoping will happen is that all throughout education, from the universities to the school systems, to the publishers, to the people who make the policies, that there will be a kind of a set of universal ideas that everybody embraces as, you know, this is what we can hang our hat on. And although, and as far as the main components of teaching reading that are necessary, they way to differentiate instruction so that those kids who are struggling get more and better instruction in these underlying skills that they need of language processing, from speech sounds on to vocabulary and everything else. I'm just hoping that we don't have another wave of, you know, resistance where by some other name, these mistaken, misinformed ideas come back and take hold again. It's so limiting and unfortunate and destructive.
Well, I'll just say this from someone who's seen it as a current public school teacher, and honestly, being early in my career, I didn't know a lot about the battles within, especially teaching reading, and because you don't see it as much with the other subjects, but I didn't even have an understanding of it. And it can be a level of stubbornness where it's, especially your person that's just not getting, I guess, indoctrinated to what this whole thing is and how people, these battles, phonics based versus whole language, it can be a bit much, because coming from the others, the ones who may feel the other side, is a level of stubbornness is very entrenched. And yeah, I'll just say that much, just from someone who's dealt with it, especially if you don't even understand it, you're almost confused by it, but it's very serious. I can see maybe where you're coming from with it. Yeah. So yes. So my final question is, of course, with teaching, I always love theme. So what people can learn from this, but what is a lesson you would want anybody that wants to become an educator, whether, especially if they want to go down your route of first starting off, you know, as a teacher, and then becoming more specialized, and then being an educator from a different role, what would be some advice that you would give to them?
Well, you can't do better unless you know better.
Mm-hmm.
So finding a place or a way to really learn the basic tenets of good reading instruction that is scientifically based. And by that, I mean understanding these foundational skills of language processing, studying the structure of language and the relevance of that to basic underlying reading processes is the first step. And if you get that, and that's what we try to do with LETRS, of course, and if you get that and you understand where the valid theoretical models are coming from, the kind of science that generates those, and you understand how to explain words to kids and what a written word represents and how to explain that, then you can refine your teaching practices and develop judgment and develop clinical skills and develop ways to adapt lessons and all that. Those are the finer points. But you can't do that refinement of teaching unless you have the basic ideas correct in your head. And you can see that learner through the lens of information about what's going on in that little black box that's making them stumble on words, for example. Right. And then and you've used the word progression over and over again today, which is a very important word, understanding the progression of how you teach reading, analogous to, everyone agrees there's a progression for learning math.
Right.
No one argues about that.
Not at all, honestly. I've never seen
it. Teaching reading, you can't just say, oh, let's focus on the main idea when the kids can't read the words. So if we can get that across and get that foundational knowledge embedded in not only new teachers, but all those who teach them, and then the publishers who are producing the materials they work with, it would make a huge difference.
I thank you for saying that. And I'm hoping those because I put it out tomorrow because I want to promote it first as far as being, so teachers can make sure they watch and learn this, because I do feel like overall, now I say as a teacher, a lot of times early in my career, where I kind of hate sometimes you go to trainings and you want to see how this stuff will be actually look inside your classroom. And then knowledge is just knowledge. And I'm very big on Bloom's taxonomy. So, you can understand information, but you have to be able to put it into practice in your actual classroom. But like I said, I saw it from firsthand experience, being able to see following that progression, understanding, even though I'm still limited in my knowledge of understanding what all the individual sounds are. When you see, if you take a child that's doesn't know basic letter sound correspondence, then you go to CVC or short vowels, then you move on in that progression, then you see them gradually, building confidence and be able to read, and those gaps close. It's like, how can you really argue with it? And it ain't even something that takes 2 years. Sometimes it could be 3 months or 4 months, however long, you choose to do that. So that's when it really started to click with me. Hey, this might be the way to go. But of course, it seems like in education don't always work that way. But I definitely want to thank you for being on. It's been a true honor to have you on and really just learn firsthand what kind of went into why, for one, you're so passionate about education. I definitely wanted to say that. But, what went into your research and why you've created all these trainings and do all these webinars about getting teachers to better their instruction.
Well, I really enjoyed this session with you, and you've asked great questions, and I think it's going to help further the cause that you're doing. Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you. And honestly, I was trying to be because I wasn't trying to get too much into the battle, because I know if you say something that's incendiary, it might be published. Some Louisa Moats founding whatever said this about Lucy Calkins or something. I know that becomes a whole thing. I've seen the articles.
We don't get personal. We can't get personal. No.
Yes, I know that. That's like a whole thing. I see how it turns into that. So I was like, no, we're just gonna focus on the actual raw science of it, not the, where people have issues with each other or anything like that. So I wanted to stay away from that. But thank you for joining me today. And thank everybody for listening. Hopefully tomorrow when I put it out, y'all will be enriched by listening to this.